Professor, welcome to 13 Action News. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
So you've been affiliated with Latino Decisions for a long time. They come out with these polls every once in a while. Tell me that I'm wrong, but it just seems like the results are almost always the same. Trump looks terrible, Republicans look terrible, Hispanics are going to be with the Democratic candidate. Has anything changed? Is there anything new in the latest poll?
I think there's a couple things that jump out. The first is, yes, obviously Trump is a disaster for the Republicans. He'll be lucky to break 20% nationally, so he'll do worse than Romney did, which is, of course, worse than McCain did, which is, of course, worse than Bush did. So the trajectory's not good there. But you're seeing a little bit of a difference between in the presidential election and the Senate elections. A couple of things jump out. First is that, obviously, Senate candidates are a little less well-known and less well-defined, so there's more room there for some movement there. You also saw that there's a roll-off, right? So 6% in Nevada of our poll here, and this is 400 registered Latino voters in Nevada, said they're not going to vote in the Senate race. They're basically coming out to vote against Trump, and then they may roll off and not vote there. The other thing we asked is, were you aware of, in this case, Cortez Masto and Joe Heck's positions on immigration, and 60% of Latino voters didn't know either candidate standing on what is largely the animating issue for most Latino voters.
So let's talk about that, since you brought up the Senate race and a couple of interesting things there. And just so people know, the numbers among Latinos in this poll, 61 to 22 in favor of Cortez Masto. But both of those things you just mentioned are not good for her, I would think. That there's going to be 6% of Hispanics who go out to vote against Trump. And by the way, maybe not so much for Clinton as against Trump. And then you mentioned that 60% or so don't know what her position is on this, as you correctly put it, this animating issue, which, by the way, is higher here as an animating issue than it is nationally. 38% nationally, 51% here, according to your poll. What does that tell you about her?
I think it tells you that, A, Trump and Clinton sucking up much of the oxygen, right? And that's what people know. It's dominated the media coverage there. And the other part is Cortez Masto, as we know from some of the public polling out there, she's just not well known, particularly in southern Nevada, which is, of course, home to the vast majority of Latinos in Nevada here. Now, there's been efforts on both Heck and Cortez Masto to reach the Spanish audience here, but so far, I think it's been hard for them to break through, particularly over the summer, and separate themselves from the presidential race a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting because you mentioned this. Just so people know the approval numbers with both of them. Cortez Masto, 51 to 24 among Latino voters. Heck, 23 to 50. But if you notice, that means about a quarter of the electorate doesn't have an opinion on either one. Again, that gives either of them an opportunity to define the other. And again, Cortez Masto, you would think, in a Senate race that looks like it's a dead heat, needs to win Hispanics, probably the same kind of margin that Hillary Clinton will win them. Or you mentioned Romney from 2012. Romney got crushed. 71% of Hispanics, according to exit polls, voted for Barack Obama. Is that, again, a danger sign for her?
It is. She's running, I think, about 9 points behind Clinton at this point. Heck's about 8 points ahead of Trump. So you're absolutely right. If you figure Latinos are going to be about 19–20% potentially of the electorate here, that's a couple of points, when in the aggregate there, and that very well could be the difference come that race. And we didn't just see that in the Nevada race. That was something we pulled in 7 states. 6 of them have Senate races, 3 of them competitive here, Arizona and Florida, and that same thing jumped out across all the states.
Meaning that there's separation between the presidential race and the Senate race.
Absolutely, separation of the president race, and then just lack of knowledge about where the Democrat and Republican Senate candidates sit on immigration. We also find in the poll, though, right, that when we prompt them with this, if you knew this, how would this affect your vote? And then you see what you'd expect, the shifts you'd expect to see. But we looked at the 2014 Senate race in Colorado, where you had Cory Gardner and Udall, very different positions on immigration. In our exit poll of that race, the vast majority didn't know that difference, and Udall ends up losing by 40,000 votes, even though the Democratic governor wins that election. So you do see that drop off in support and the roll off in voters here just from the lack of knowledge.
You know, it's interesting because you mentioned the fact that they don't have a clear picture of either Heck or Cortez Masto on immigration. I find that interesting in this sense. Heck has gotten pummeled for essentially being a Republican and some of the things that he said. So I think some of the negativity, 23 to 50 approval rating, comes from him just being a Republican. But maybe he's done a good enough job in either, if you want to use a maybe not the maybe a pejorative term, fuzzed up his position as opposed to maybe taking positions that aren't the same down the line as Trump or others. That maybe that's a good sign for him. As Attorney General, Catherine Cortez Masto would have had no reason to be outspoken, really, about immigration. They have tried to make it seem like she's a lifelong supporter of immigration reform and DACA and DAPA, but she really said nothing about it as Attorney General. And the question has to be asked here again, Professor, is whether or not her lack of definition there is why she is lagging behind Clinton and is so unknown by so many Hispanic voters.
And I think it's an overall absolutely there. And if those 51-23 numbers roughly jive with partisanship among registered Latinos. So that unknown is really the independents, the third-party folks here who don't have the partisan cues, not going to work for them. So absolutely they need to get out. And the other thing we found in there is, contact, right? Have you been contacted in this campaign? And these are, likely voters, registered voters, people who have vote histories here. And Nevada is one of the higher states, but it's still less than 50% of these voters that have even been contacted for a get out the vote or a registration push here. So I think that goes into the lack of sort of engagement. And we know historically that, Latino voters are tough to turn out. Democrats have done well when they put a lot of resources in. Nevada's one of those states. Colorado's another one of those states here. But you go look at Arizona, similar demographics, very, very low turnout here. So, and in 14, of course, we know what happened.
Disaster for the Democrats, bad minority turnout across the board.
So, and you see even the favorabilities, Clinton's behind Obama in Nevada in terms of favorability there. So I think, the context is there, but the operation of it and the execution of that is what we're going to need to see for the Democrats next 2 months.
So let's talk about the separation and how she is running, Cortez Masto is running behind Clinton. The numbers in the presidential race for Hispanics, 70 to 14, Clinton is winning over Trump. The approval numbers, 64-31 for Clinton, which is very good, but not like overwhelmingly great. But Trump is 18-78. If she wins Hispanics by that kind of margin in this state, the margin for error for Trump to be able to win, he would have to win so big among other cohorts. It's very difficult, is it not?
Absolutely. No, it is. And then you throw in the African-American vote here, which may even be worse than it was 4 years ago, which would be hard to believe with Barack Obama on
exactly.
So,
you mean worse for the Republican nominee?
Worse for the Republican, absolutely there. So you start looking at, in a statewide race, that's going to be very, very tough at the top. But again, if you see roll off, folks not coming, not voting in that race there. Enough people in Southern Nevada might know Joe Heck's name. As you said, he's done a nice job mudding sort of the immigration waters a little bit there. It's going to be a dogfight.
I guess what I'm wondering about Hillary Clinton versus Barack Obama, there's been much in the media, as you know, about all the lack of trust, the numbers, and the fact that she just does not have the kind of robust numbers that the Democrats would love to see. In fact, if she did, then we wouldn't even be talking about the presidential race, right? It would be over already. But she does. And even though 64-31 is very good, it's not great that a third of Hispanics potentially could vote against her. Is this something that she needs to worry about, not just here, but across the country?
Yeah, I mean, obviously she's in a much better position than the Republicans are, but yeah, absolutely in key swing states. And again, what's interesting this time around is a lot of those swing states also have Senate races in Florida, as I mentioned, Colorado here, Arizona, right? Any sort of less support for her might hurt Democrats down the ticket, and then the ability of voters to differentiate between the candidates at the different levels has the potential to end up with some split outcomes come November.
You mentioned these other battleground states having Senate races, but there is no battleground state, not just because I love Nevada, but there's no battleground state that really has the kind of closeness so far in the public polling between the presidential race and the Senate race. The Senate race here looks like it could be one of the closest, if not the closest, in the country. And so all of these nuances that we're talking about could make a big difference. And the one thing we haven't talked about is the turnout among Hispanic voters, which was terrible, as were a lot of traditionally Democratic constituencies in 2016. 2014. But in 2008 and 2012, you correct me, you know the numbers better than I think it was 15%, then 18% total electorate. There are predictions that it could be 20% this time. Do you think that's true? And if so, why is that because of Trump? Is it because of better organization? What's the reason?
I think it's both those things. Trump is an incredible mobilizer for the Democrats. We asked a couple different ways: more enthusiasm for voting, or do you think it's more important to vote?
Right.
And overwhelmingly, 16 is seen as a much more important election, at the top of the ticket at least, than 2012. And we follow up why, and the modal response is stopping Trump. So he is, that message is sunk in. But again, we were really surprised to see across the board, across the states we looked at, this differentiation at the Senate race.
It really is more of a motivation to vote against Trump than for Clinton. Isn't that what you picked up in this poll?
Absolutely. I mean, she's the second, supporting Clinton
Right.
is the second answer, and these are open-ended responses.
But what's driving people to vote, and this is true like in a ballot question or even in some races, voting no animates people more than going out to vote for something, right?
Absolutely. In the case with Trump, that this has been his hallmark of his campaign. He's obviously tried to move a little bit there, and we actually did a short poll on that. What's the impact nationally on the Arizona speech and the Mexican visit, and that's a campaign stunt. Was overwhelmingly Latinos saw it that way there, but yeah, I mean, and that is what's dominated the conversation. And even though I think most of us see, and you're correct here, that that Senate race has huge potential impact in terms of who's going to control the Senate come next January here. It just hasn't reached the saliency of the presidential race.
You mentioned that there's the perception that the Arizona speech and the Mexican visit were campaign stunts, part of the campaign to try to win the election as opposed to anything that's going to move voters. Do you get a sense from the polling that a large majority of the voters that are being polled, Latino voters, are locked in, and that Trump could say almost anything at this point that wouldn't matter?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, we've been following that for a long time. You see that in the numbers. I think there's like 2 or 3%, don't have an opinion of him.
Right.
Same way with Clinton. They're just very, very well defined at this point. So the point, the larger question then is the turnout issue, right? Is this difference? Is the Trump candidacy going to get 20%? Latinos become 20% of the electorate here. And if it is, and they overwhelmingly support Clinton, that's good news down ticket. But if it's a little bit lower, there's some hesitancy, some roll-off there, we could end up with a situation like we saw in 2012, right, where Obama wins fairly handily in Nevada and Heller defeats Berkeley.
Yeah, and Heller defeating Berkeley, and that's a very good analogy because Obama won the state relatively easily, but I think about 6 points, but not by enough to really drag enough people into the Berkeley camp, and she lost by 12,000 votes in a huge Democratic year. Now, I think that again, does not augur well necessarily for Catherine Cortez Masto unless she can consolidate not just the Democratic base, but especially the Hispanic base, which she clearly has not done yet.
No, I would agree with that. And this poll is consistent with what we found in April. We similar types of dynamics there. And the other part that I think worries the Democrats is how much they're getting hit by the outside money. It's just been, as you've been tweeting about, it's
Right.
just been unbelievable, and it's not going to relent until November.
Final question. You asked about some issues here, and I mentioned one of them about how immigration at 51%, Latino voters caring about it, is above the national average of 38%. But when you asked what's the most important thing that Congress and the president can address, it was essentially a dead heat between immigration and the economy and jobs. Tell me your experience with polling. A lot of people like to say, everyone, the media always talks about Hispanics and immigration, but most Hispanics care more about the economy and jobs like most people do. What's the truth?
Absolutely. So we asked that question a couple of different ways to get at that. We
Right.
asked one that prompts, the Latino community, what's the most important issue, and then sort of a generic, what do you think is the most important issue? And those issues tend to flop, right? It's been consistently, since I've been involved with this since 2012, it's been immigration and jobs for the Latino community, and then when you ask them, in general what it is, it's jobs and then immigration. The other thing we have noticed in this year's polling, though, is a creep up in people offering, and these, again, open-ended questions,
Right.
Anti-Latino discrimination, anti-immigrant discrimination, and I think that's largely a Trump effect there, that's seen as almost a separate issue to immigration.
Yeah, that is endemic to this election and attributable to the Republican nominee. Professor, always a pleasure to see you. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
All right.